started. So once again, I'm super excited to be working on Frank's book. And I say working on because this is a journey for me. I've been following Frank for a while. And just because he is trauma informed with IFS. And so instead of just learning IFS, it's important to look at the complex trauma aspect. We were just having a conversation before we started about how when you're working with complex trauma, really the challenge is going to be not only finding layers and layers and layers of protector parts, but unblending those protector parts. It can take a long time when we're working with more complex presentation. And so I think my favorite saying is the more you heal, the more you reveal. And when we talk about reveal, we're talking about layers and layers of parts. So anyway, so here we are. This is our second meeting, which is very exciting. And we're going to be doing chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. And once again, something we were talking about right before we got started is how the language gets changed. And, the 6 Fs have been very helpful around how to unblend a part, but Frank puts them, kind of mixes up the order. He gives it steps instead of the specific 6 Fs. And so just want to put that out there in case you have gone through like level 1 and you're like, well, this isn't really following. That's okay. We're just going to take it from Frank's perspective because he is the trauma therapist here and he's brilliant. So like I said, honored to be doing this. So let's move on. So we're going to be doing chapter 5, getting started, and some steps involved. If you missed our first meeting, it's recorded, so you can go find it. And then we're going to do chapter 6, the first 3 steps. And that's going to be identifying the target part and then helping it separate, helping it unblend. And then Laura's going to present on self-energy and gaining access to internal wisdom. That's chapter 7. And then chapter 8, we're going to be looking into those final 3 Fs with the befriending, and then all the way to finding that exile and what its fear is. So let's get this party started. So how to start your IFS session. Super grateful for this. Let your clients share what they feel is essential. What energy is showing up? We don't even necessarily have to say this. What parts are driving the bus? We add the word part or aspect to each of their struggles. Like, for example, a client says, I was really upset with the news this weekend. I hear there, and then the therapist is going to respond, I hear there's a part of you that was really upset with the news this weekend. Did I get that right? That's not only just a really nice thing to say to get our parts work started, but that's just a great way to mentor appropriate communication. Like that kind of comes right out of Imago with couples therapy. So once again, you don't have to necessarily sit down with your client and say, oh, we're going to be doing parts work and this is what a part is. And your client's like looking at you like, what? So it's just the client comes in and says, beautiful weekend. And my sister-in-law was in the hospital. And you're just like, I hear there's a part of you that had a wonderful weekend, but there's an aspect of you that was concerned about your sister-in-law. And just, I had a part of me that had a wonderful weekend too. We're just mentoring it, right? We're just kind of easing into it without like a big confusing conversation. So love that Frank says that. He doesn't even put more than a couple sentences into how to start an IFS session. And then getting started and the steps involved. So also mentor work with your own parts. There's a part of me, ... We can be using that throughout. And then finding out from the client, which issues would you like to focus on today? Or what a part would like to go first? But maybe more so, catch me up on your week and where would you like to start? But at the end of the day, it's literally like what part would like attention? What part would like to go first? You don't have to say it that way because that part will show up. But we're looking for the energy. And if you say, which issue would you like to focus on first? That would bring the part forward. We're looking for an agreed upon target. And Frank is all about initiating a session without any parts psychoeducation once again. So it's really our job as the therapist to kind of assess using our nonverbal ability to communicate, our right brain to right brain communication, the energy in the room and trying to identify what it is that the client would like to work on first. Of course, though, of course, like you've heard a million times, we have to get permission. So are you literally going to say, like, do I have permission? After identifying a target part, this begins that sometimes complicated journey of gaining permission to access a part, especially if it's a client's childhood wound. So we want to remember the main goal of the protectors is to keep the pain and the discomfort away. And so protector parts may distract, they may derail to avoid the pain carried by that external part. We run into that in so many different ways. And, you know, I'm an EMDR basic trainer, and a lot of you are EMDR therapists. And, blocking beliefs. We love using Jim Knight's blocking belief because it basically introduces us to the parts that are protecting those exiles, protecting those wounded children, protecting those really young parts that have a lot of pain. And so we really need to figure out how to work with the protectors that show up and assess how it is that they are distracting or they are derailing, and then be able to work with them, because we can't do anything until they permit us entry. So out of a group of protector parts, we want the client to select one to get to know. So our goal is target part separate and then unblend from the client's self by helping the client get to know that part independent of itself. And so we bring in the word self. Now, a little bit about my own journey. I've been doing ego state work for years. I work with Farnsworth Lobenstein, and we've been doing an advanced training. We really think it's a part 3 to all EMDR basic trainings because it's about working with complex trauma and dissociation. But one of the things that I really appreciated on my own IFS journey is this concept of self, this capital S self, or this higher self, or this self energy. It really gave me a different perspective. And Frank's going to get into a little bit about what's the difference between the brain and the mind. And I believe that self engages the mind. It's something bigger. It's something so big that we really can't wrap our brain around it. And so, you know, if you do energy work, or you're, working with a part of you that isn't necessarily described by the structures of the brain, then that's kind of what we're talking about. So before we talk about separating or unblending parts, and the idea of doing that is to make sure that self is present. I just have a quick video on what self is, and then Laura's going to present on it in chapter 7. So here he is, the man himself. Let's see if my videos are working.
Can you say what self is within the IFS model?
Yeah, so self is now become the centerpiece of the model, and I just stumbled onto that. There are a lot of models that talk about subpersonalities, actually. But because of my family therapy background, when I would try to have dialogues between my client and these parts, I started to notice that other parts would interfere. And as I got them to separate, because when you're working with a family, you want to have just 2 people talk to each other, and if a third starts to interfere, you ask them to step out. Mm-hmm. So I thought maybe the same operation in this family, and I would ask them to get these other parts, these interfering ones, to give us some space. And when I would do that, it was like a new person would pop out of nowhere and would be calm and confident and would be curious about the part that they were talking to, and the part would sort of disarm, mm-hmm. and would be much more willing to talk about itself and to be vulnerable, actually. Mm-hmm. And when I would ask people about who is that, I'd say, what part is that? They'd say, that's not a part like these others. That's mm-hmm. me. Mm-hmm. That's myself. Mm-hmm. So we came to call that the capital S, self, to distinguish it from the common usage of the word self, which means the whole person. And as I tried it with other clients, it was like the same person would pop out. And always undamaged kind of essence that, in addition to being curious, confident, and calm, often would have compassion just immediately for the part they were working with, for the person they were talking to, would have a lot of courage. So we have what we call the 8 C words that characterize self. Courage, creativity, clarity. So the part would change its image and see it much more for what it is, actually. And connectedness. There's a kind of innate desire in self to connect to self in parts and people, and a sense of being much more connected than isolated. Mm-hmm. So that was remarkable when I started to see that in a couple clients, and I thought, wow, they must have had really good parenting, because how else could they have this kind of ego strength? And I would comb their histories to find the person that they got it from, because I was trained in attachment theory, to believe that to have any of that, you had to have gotten it from another person, from an outside relationship. And many of these clients there was no person in their life they possibly could have gotten that from. So I really started to have to shift at some point to believe that this is just inherent in us, that it's sort of our birthright, and that in addition to those qualities, there's a kind of wisdom about how to heal internally and externally. So self-heals is a bumper sticker someday I'm going to print, because it's really true. So often as we help clients access that state and then begin to relate to these parts, they sort of take over the session, and I just get out of the way, because they really do know how to heal themselves. And that's a tough sell. Both the idea that we're multiple and the idea that this is in there undamaged and knows how to heal isn't syntonic with our culture at all. So it's been a kind of uphill battle to convince people.
Asked my chat GBT to make him a bumper sticker, and so we have a bumper sticker there. The new relationship with my chat GBT. Okay, so anyway, that concept of self, and the reason why I put that in there, and I just want to honor this, is because this was new to me. And there's also what's called self-led parts, which is basically what I think I'm full of personally. I'm just full of self-led parts, because I think I'm connected with my self energy, but sometimes I'm not so sure, because I have a really, really powerful left brain. So once again, this self is super important. And like I said, Laura's going to be spending a whole chapter on it. So that's exciting. So strengthening the self to part energy is really the ultimate goal. Developing a trusting relationship between self and part. We want to help clients learn about the part's job and the fear associated with it. So remember, we've got a protector part. All protector parts are created out of fear. And those protector parts are protecting those wounded children. I love Sandra Paulson's work when she talks about unzipping the costume of the protector, and inside there's a vulnerable little child. So whenever you're looking at your client and they're being difficult, like, they're avoiding, or they're doing something that might even be irritating you, I want you to just imagine that if you unzipped that protector exterior, that inside is just a frightened, wounded little child, and they're here to get help. That's why they're here to be with you, to get their attachment ruptures repaired. Let's see here. Knowing the fear is connected to the wound is important. And doesn't matter which protective part you work with, they all lead to wounds. And that's true. And you can shift from one protector part to another. We have to go with the protector part that's really the most in charge, because they're not going to let you through. But we'll talk more about that as we continue. So getting to know or finding, and this is the process of finding a target part, it involves the mind focusing energy and intention on a specific cluster of neural networks. And that concept of neural networks, the brain science, has come a really long way, especially in the last 10 years, to help give us language. And I don't have my brain wrapped around it yet, but I am going to understand this brain science with parts at some point. And I'm going to share it all with you, because why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? Okay, so the 6 F's, steps involved in identifying and working with protector parts. Once the client has identified an agreed upon target part, the journey to find the wounded child has begun. So you have this energy that presents itself right in the beginning of the session. Working with protector parts can be complicated due to their job, which is to keep the hurt away. Protector parts will do whatever it takes. Let me repeat that. Whatever it takes. They distract, they disrupt, they confuse, they avoid moving forward, because the pain of that exile part is basically what their job is. That's their career. And then once again, the more we heal, the more we reveal, because you can get a protector part that shows up in your room, in your session. And then there's going to be another protector part that's going to get activated as you start to get close to maybe what could be that wounded child exile. And I got to throw this out there because this is about being IFS informed. Frank doesn't use the language of firefighters and managers, at least not yet. He's got other language that he uses, but just know that when I'm saying protector parts, I'm referring to both, because at the end of the day, the firefighter protects today and the manager protects the future. So those are both going to always be included. I pulled some pictures out of the book just because it's easier to, I'm a visual learner. And so these are the 6 F's that we've got. We've got finding that part. So identifying the target part, where it's located. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What is it that the client's coming in with? If the client's really angry because somebody cut them off in the parking lot, that's a really good part to work with because the energy is right there. We do the same thing in EMDR therapy, because if the client's already activated, then we can just jump right into the work. Second, to focus on it. We want to help the client shift the focus to their attention internally. Let's go inside and find the part. What is that part like? What does it look like? We're going to talk about using questions like color, shape, form, texture. Fleshing it out. How does the client know the part? So what does the client know about this part and how it functions and why it does what it does? And we want to work with the separation and unblending of the part. So literally pulling the part out so that the self, the capital S self, can work with the part. And once again, why we're doing this book is because with complex trauma, this is a big ask, right? We usually have blended parts and we usually need to use direct access. And we need to use direct access until the part can unblend. And so that's exciting because we're going to learn how to do that in the other chapters. Feeling towards. How does the client feel towards the part? This is another part of IFS that just kind of blew me away. If I'm feeling toward a part, and that language is essential, it means there's separation. So if the client can't, or the client can't feel toward the part that we're working with, then we don't have necessarily the self energy that we need to go forward. Once again, why we spend so much time in this particular space, getting that part unblended. Complex trauma, the harder it's going to be. Befriending it, building an internal relationship between the self and the part, learning about its job and its positive intention. It's almost like couples therapy. Well, it is kind of couples therapy. And then last but not least, what is its fear? All protector parts, managers, firefighters, whatever you want to call them, all come out of fear. So that's how they're developed. It's because there was an initial fear. Remember, complex trauma is inescapable. It is, there's an attachment rupture because they're not being kept safe. And it happens over and over and over again, usually under the age of 7 until the pandemic. So we've got the fear. Ask the part, what are you afraid would happen if you no longer ... And addressing the protector's fear to get permission to access the wound. We've got some work to do. I threw in some slides of just once again to just reiterate the F's here. And so I'm just going to go through them and then go to the recording and just listen to them again. I have to repeat things over and over and over again in different ways in order for me to learn. And so I'm sharing that also with you. So just find the part, find the energy, having the client take a breath. Do the 3-3-3. The 3-3-3 is orienting. 3 things that you can find that are rectangles. 3 things that you can find that are blue. Shaking out 3 parts of your body. All of my therapists are very familiar with the 3-3-3. drop in and enter your inner world. And then what part would like attention? If more than one part or when other parts enter, who wants to be the spokesperson or who wants to be heard? Do we need to do a parts map first? Where in the body is the energy? So this is going to be more depending on what routine works for you. A lot of my clients that know that they're doing internal family systems or some type of parts work, I'll say, where do you want to work today? Do you have a part that really wants to be heard or needs attention? And if I'm not really sharing the details because it would be too overwhelming, I'm just like, so what's up? Like what's coming up for you? Where would you like to start? Basically, it's like, where's the energy? Focus. Do I have permission? Does this feel okay? Is it okay if we work with this part? You know, our goal is to welcome, acknowledge, appreciate, accept, and earn trust with our parts. And so once again, we call it what? What? Welcome, accept, acknowledge, appreciate, and earn trust. That internal relationship is so important. So as we're focusing on, before we flesh out the part, we are literally working on welcoming the part. If I have a suicidal part and I'm like, I just want this part to know that I'm here for it, that we're all on the same journey, then that's exactly what we want to be doing. We want to be focusing and turning our attention to that very specific part. So fleshing out how the part shows up. What do we see? What do we hear? What do we feel? What do we taste? What do we smell? Those are going to be the senses. What color, shape, texture, temperature? What would it say to you? Have it act like it normally would. Where do you sense it? Inside your body or outside of your body? Just some examples. You know, my client has a little child in a fetal position in a chair. That was unblended. That was a good sign. The client is so angry that they can't even answer the questions. The client has a memory that pops up that does have a taste or a smell. We want to ask how it would normally act if we can see like some type of behavior. And then color, shape, form, texture is something that I love to do. I have a parts interview that I refer out that's on my website. That's like, I want you to find that energy. If it has a color, what color is it? Green. If it has texture, it's slimy. If it has a shape or form, it's a puddle. If it has a temperature, it's warm. If it could say anything, what would it say? Help me. That was my client's asthma, and she had mucus in her chest. So everything is a part. It's really exciting. Another example would be pain in the back pain. So color, it's red, it's sharp, it's like a shape of a saw, and it's the temperature is cold as steel. And what would it say is, why are you paying attention to everything else and everyone else and not me? In other words, that client need to go see a chiropractor. So parts have all kinds of aspects to them. This comes from where I'm getting my parts work training, which is IFSCA out of Canada, because their program goes right into complex trauma. So, you know, they don't mess around. I'm in their second course, which goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And we are talking about dissociation and dissociative parts. And Frank Anderson actually recommended this course. This was, well, I don't say was, it is the only course that he basically supports when doing his extra retreats or whatever it is that he does someday. Love to go on a retreat with him. But at the end of the day, Derek Scott was running that program, and he unfortunately passed. But the program is still running nicely. And so I'm doing a lot of work with them, and I'm really learning a lot about complex trauma and IFS. And the secret is you can get in right away. So it's just a secret maybe we keep for those trauma therapists that are really looking to get IFS informed and are on a waiting list. Okay, so but anyway, this is flipping over. You flip the protector part over and check out the underbelly. The protector is in response to. How is it helping? What would be at risk if if it didn't do its job? How long has this part been doing this? What would make it feel 5% better? We're just looking for a little bit of a compromise, maybe. And then is there self energy, and what polyvagal state is it? Flipping into the self energy. That polyvagal piece is really important, but in order to just honor time, because I'm already can tell I'm already talking too much. I promise we will get to that. But when you are assessing protector parts, knowing if they're dorsal vagal, dissociative, or if they are sympathetic, really makes a big difference, especially if you're an EMDR therapist, because we can go in and desensitize a protector part with the EMDR, and that's a whole other presentation, integrating EMDR with IFS. Super exciting. We'll get there. We will get there. Fourth, feeling towards. How do you feel toward this part? Or what is it like to be with this part? Do you hate this part? Does this part disgust you? Can you notice what the part does, how hard it works, how it's helping you? You know, working with addiction. My client has a drinking part, and we're 1 year into sobriety, and we're doing some grief work. You know, what is it that that part did for you? What is it that you miss about that part? How did that part help you? What is the energy you're picking up on from this part? Can we engage the higher self, or is there sympathetic or dorsal vagal energy? And the higher self are going to be those 8Cs, and we'll be getting to those. I love that it's 8Cs. I understand there are other letters that would go great with the 8Cs, but the 8Cs just make things, you know, easy. I like easy. Easy and able to remember. Our fifth step about befriending, we need validation. So we look at how is the part responding to what you are feeling toward it. So if the client is feeling curiosity and compassion toward the part, that's wonderful. Can the part accept it? That's the big question. Or if the client is feeling some type of like, I don't want to go there, I'm just disgusted, that's going to be dorsal vagal energy. And if the client's like angry and pissed off and I don't like that part, and I'm pointing to my chair over there because I like to use the chair, empty chair, then the client's in sympathetic energy. So we want to validate what it does for the system. We want to validate the job in response to, like, how did it get this job? Well, I drink because it numbs my feelings, and I don't like to feel. I've never liked to feel. Validate it if it's protecting something. Validate what is at risk if it didn't do its job. Validate if there's anything else it wants you to know. How far back does it go, and is it from before birth? Which is a really interesting question. My IFS therapist always asked me that, and I know a lot about my family going all the way back to the 1850s, and I'm like, oh yeah, it goes all the way back to coming across the ocean and starting out in Connecticut after leaving Ireland. Like, wow, that's really powerful and intense. Not all my parts, but some of them have some of that energy. I didn't know that. My brain knows that. My brain just answers the question. So and that's another thing we learn in EMDR, that, you know, the brain can do the work. Brain is powerful. So validate, validate, validate. That's what we're hearing. And so if you get stuck on validate, and I know it's an easy word, but then sometimes, you know, I'm like, what exactly do you mean validate? So I love this acronym. I love HUGS. The first step to unblending is to validate, validate, validate. Gabor Mate says we need to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. And he may be talking about the world, but we're also talking about our parts. So how do we validate? We give our parts hugs. I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I get what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So the client's talking about, you know, yeah, and then I would drink, and then when I was at the party, I felt like I could socialize, like I could make friends. I was funny. People liked me. And I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. I get what you're saying. I can totally see that. You are funny. And I bet when you drink, you're even funnier. I hear it and I get it. I understand it. Hugs. Love it. Send all my parents home with, don't yell at your teenager. Don't tell your teenager what to do when they're 16, 17. You can tell them another time, but when they're mad, when they're upset, you say, oh, I hear exactly what you're saying. I get it. I so get it. Like, I see you. I get you. It's amazing how helpful that is. Just give it an acronym and you'll remember it. Fear, what is at risk if the part doesn't do its job? What is the worst case scenario? What is the protector part terrified of? So once again, you're looking at the client's protector part, unzipping that costume. What is inside that's so horrific? So getting started, the trauma protectors can be difficult and require skill beyond the basics. And now, this is really Frank moving into the complex trauma piece. We want to break down the 6 F's into 3 different sections. First, we're identifying the part and checking to see if it's unblended. Second, once that's done, we want to focus on helping the client access their self-energy. And then third, we build that relationship. So it's about the part. Is the part unblended? Then we want to find capital S self. And then we want to build this part to self relationship. They always say that you can't love somebody else until you love yourself. Well, this is what we're doing here. And if you're not able to do parts work, then you're probably struggling with your external relationships. This comes from Frank's book. Basically, he's talking about Beyond the 6 F's, which is speaking specifically to complex trauma. So yay, because that's why we're here, IFS and complex trauma. Chapter 6, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, this is what breaks down the 6 F's. And so once again, the order is just kind of blended in here. Get that play on words, it's blended. I'll try to unblend it for you so that we can understand it. But let's keep moving on. So we're moving into our Chapter 6, find, focus, flesh out, identifying the part, and helping it separate. So what does that look like? So first of all, we want to check and make sure your client is in self-energy. Is there self-energy? When there is a distortion, our parts can be activated and they can get super defensive and they're blended in that part. If the client doesn't want to do the work, then the client will be blended with a part that doesn't want to do the work. You can see if you can unblend it, but you might need to just work with that part right there, which is called direct access. So identifying a target part is the first step to unblending. By recognizing, validating, and naming the target part opens the door to further exploration. So hugs, I hear you, I understand you, I get you, I see you. So the first step is to unblend and get permission from parts. And so once again, this is where we can be spending a lot of time. And to be honest with you, the book is pretty much about these next couple slides. When clients are blended with their part, it can be difficult validating what they are experiencing in the present. So if the client's blended, we're going to have to work with it from a different perspective than if the client's part is unblended. Reality can be distorted according to the client. If you, I heard this yesterday in something that I was listening to, but the client said something like, I'm trying to think, it had to do with addiction. The client said, oh, and I'm never going to get any better. And the therapist was like, well, you are getting better. You are doing this, this, and this. And I thought, oh, you're arguing with their part. That's not going to work. So it's really cool what you start to hear and what you realize. First, we need to validate it. I totally hear what you're saying. What you're saying is you don't feel like you're making any progress. So we need to go in and validate first. Clients move from part to part and not access self-energy. That is a complete possibility. Meeting the client where they are at, validate with hugs to start the relationship on the right foot. I hear you, I understand you, I get you, I see you. Recognizing and validating each part's experience significantly contributes to ultimately gaining permission and unblending. So if there's anything that we're taking away from here, no matter what comes out of the client's mouth, you're going to want to hear it, understand it, get it, and see it. Because if you're doing anything other than that, then you're probably creating what would be in family systems, a triangle with the, and I'm getting way ahead of myself here, with the manager part that's having the issue with the client's behavior to begin with. All right, so let's just pretend I didn't say that. We'll get to it. So once again, can't reiterate enough. I hear you. I understand you. I get you. I see you. So funny. I'm seeing all kinds of typos here. Looking at the neurobiology can help explain how the parts express themselves. So let's look at what the mind is. Frank does a bit of a description here. And I really struggled with this. So like what the mind is and what is the mind-brain connection. And who know better to talk to about mind than Daniel Siegel? So the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, integrates with our thoughts and emotions. And the mind helps direct the flow of energy. So the brain is the structure and the mind is the energy. So let's see what that looks like.
You can basically talk about the 100 billion cells in this system that's connected to the body. Right? Can't see it back there. And this system can be studied. And neuroscientists study all the time. And a lot of neuroscientists in the group would say, well, the mind is just the activity of the brain. Let's move on. But if the mind were just the activity of the brain, you know what the result of that would be? You'd be a slave to your brain. And if you're a therapist, all you would do would be pushing a pill on somebody. So the issue that the mind is not the same as the brain, or not just the activity of the brain, is hugely controversial for a neuroscientist. But for a therapist, it makes all the difference. So here was the definition I suggested to this group, and 100% agreement came out, if you remember that. And it goes like this, that the mind is an embodied and relational process. It's in the body, and it's in our relationships with one another. And it's an embodied relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. That's it. Everybody agreed upon it. You know, the anthropologist, sociologist, the linguistics person, everyone was in agreement. So it was a strange moment. The group lasted for 4.5 years because we could share a common vocabulary. And since that time, this was the mid-90s now, I began working on, well, what does that mean for mental health? What's a healthy mind? And in the book Mindsight, what I present really for the public for the first time is what I've been doing in the privacy of my psychotherapy practice. Right? It's all stories based on actual people, and the way that if you look at a process that regulates the flow of energy and information, you actually come up with things, and this is where this would get to be a long talk, but the bottom line is you can actually define what a healthy mind is. I don't mean describe it. I mean define it.
You're still muted, Paula.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I worked on this a little bit. I really had to wrap my brain around the mind piece. I think I've gotten it. So anyway, I just found something really short due to time. So the imagination also plays a significant role in the mind and is a powerful factor in promoting neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity. And I think a lot of us use imagination a lot. And if anything, I hope that it gives me permission at least to use it even more. Imagination and neuroplasticity in the human mind and the neural pathways embodies that mind's growth and transformation. So each time you have an experience, neurons fire in the brain. Once again, there's a lot of neurobiology in Frank's book, so I'm trying to get us a foundation here. And I've got to be honest, I'm a little, whatever, it doesn't matter. Each time we have an experience, neurons fire in the brain, and this firing strengthens and grows a new neural synapses. So the neurons that fire together wire together. And I think of it like a path where you have 2 feet of snow and you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And you've got this great pathway. Now you can't step off the pathway because you got 2 feet of snow. So it's the same thing. The neurons just fire and wire, fire and wire, fire and wire, and it gives us this pathway. And the pathway is our neural networks. So we grow new nerve cells through what's called neurogenesis. And then when the nervous system is working smoothly and harmoniously, they call this neurointegration. So as the mind is related to function, the brain is related to structure. So once again, we're going to think of the brain as the structure, and we talk about the structure with our three aspects of the brain, with our prefrontal cortex, and then we've got our limbic system and our brainstem. But think of the mind as the energy, the path that's like the river that runs through it. And the brain basically consists of a ton of nerve cells, dendrites, and synapses. Probably not what you need to know, but I needed to know. So I created a slide for it. The basic unit of the nervous system, where nerves send electrical signals to the brain. Why am I blanking on her name? Well, the last book that we read, Polyvagal Informed EMDR, they talked about how it was like a lightning show, how the electricity just shot through all of these neural networks. And, if you're curious, we've got 85 billion neurons. We've got 100 trillion synapses and 100 chemical neurotransmitters. The funny thing about the transmitters, Frank says, is we're only working with 5 of them when it comes to working with depression. So we've got our brain wrapped around 5 neurotransmitters, and there's 95 other ones out there. So we really are just working with the tip of the iceberg. And then once again, the whole concept here is neurons that fire together, wire together. And at the end of the day, that's what a part is. A part is going to be the energy that's within a certain neural network of neurons that are firing and wiring, firing and wiring, firing and wiring. So, love these 2-minute neuroscience videos if you've never seen them. Actually, you know what? In order to honor time, I'm actually going to skip this. Well, it's 2 minutes. What the heck?
Do you suffer from joint pain or discomfort?
Unless
You can tough it out, or you can get it treated by the best.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the neuron. This is a brain. Estimates vary, but right now the best guess seems to be that our brains contain around 85 billion neurons. The neuron is a nerve cell, and it's the primary functional unit of the nervous system. This is a generic image of a neuron. Neurons actually come in all shapes and sizes, but this is the prototypical version of a neuron that you'll often see in a textbook. The structures extending from the left side of the neuron that look a little bit like tree branches are called dendrites. Dendrites are the area where neurons receive most of their information. There are receptors on dendrites that are designed to pick up signals from other neurons that come in the form of chemicals called neurotransmitters. Those signals picked up by dendrites cause electrical changes in a neuron that are interpreted in an area called the soma, or the cell body. The soma contains the nucleus, which contains the DNA, or genetic material of the cell. The soma takes all the information from the dendrites and puts it together in an area called the axon hillock. If the signal coming from the dendrites is strong enough, then a signal is sent to the next part of the neuron, which is called the axon. At this point, the signal is called an action potential. The action potential travels down the axon, which is covered with myelin, an insulatory material that helps to prevent the signal from degrading. The last step for the action potential is the axon terminals, also known as synaptic buttons. When the signal reaches the axon terminals, it can cause the release of neurotransmitter. These purple structures represent the dendrites of another neuron. When a neurotransmitter is released from axon terminals, it interacts with the receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron, and then the process repeats with the next neuron. Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience.
You're probably thinking, okay, why was that important? The phase 3 in EMDR, and I'm sorry if you're not EMDR trained, but phase 3 is access and activate. It's all about the synapses. It's all about loosening the synapses when you hold the negative and positive cognition or beliefs together, and the energy that it creates between the two of them, and why EMDR doesn't work if you don't have the positive neural network. Well, at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about with parts. We've got our part, which is our negative cognition belief, and then we've got our self, our capital S self, let's say, is our positive, or it could be a self-led part. And at the end of the day, if the client doesn't really believe in that positive, whatever it is that part self is embracing, this isn't going to work, this link binding or connecting of neural networks. So we're going to get more into the neurobiology later. So that video hopefully will be helpful in another time. Neurons string together to form what is called neural networks, and neural networks is a really important term. Once again, the neural networks that we work with trauma are the like, I am worthless, I am unlovable, I am a defective, I'm unimportant, I'm invisible, I'm not safe, I'm going to die. Those are neural networks of neurons that fire and wire and fire and wire. And of course, working with trauma, the vertical networks involving top down and bottom up processing is critical when working with trauma. And I don't think that that's anything I need to tell you. But when we're going from the body and we're moving all the way up to the prefrontal cortex, and then we're moving back down from the prefrontal cortex all the way down into the body. We've got a lot going on here that we're going to be covering in the book, because we're looking at polyvagal. We're looking at where we can use certain modalities that we know. We're looking at where certain parts end up in, if it's their polyvagal energy. So this chart here is going to be broken down in chapters as we move forward. So the vast majority of the input to the cortex is from what has already happened. So that totally makes sense. If you were told that you were worthless your whole life, then you're going to be feeling, engaging in a neural network where you feel worthless. And that information is readily available to your prefrontal cortex. These stories are encoded, and they are encoded, not permanently encoded, but they are encoded, and we want to change that encoding. That's our goal. And that's what we do with working with the parts. And then, of course, the body keeps the score, and that all the memories that we experience are somewhere in the body. Frank Anderson refers to Brene Brown's question, the story, what story are you telling yourself right now? And that story is going to be basically encoded in those neural networks. I am worthless because, I am unlovable because, and those stories come directly from our insecure attachments, attachment ruptures, or our family systems that are not healthy. And then going inside can be very scary. It's not easy. Most clients have a storytelling part that we'll need to soften back so that we can focus attention on the feeling parts. And remember, all protector parts come out of fear. We are asking our clients to connect with their feelings, their body sensations, which can be difficult. And it's difficult because that is where their trauma experiences are held. Those protector parts are protecting the clients from the trauma. So we're going to have a lot of dissociative protector parts. And we need to know how to work with those if we're going to be trauma-informed therapists. And we are asking our clients to move toward these parts to connect and listen to what is going on. When engaged in talk therapy, we are engaged in what's called exteroceptive awareness. So that's primarily engaging the prefrontal cortex. And when going internally, we're doing interoceptive awareness. And I hope that one of the three principles of polyvagal theory is interoception. It is an unconscious surveying of your environment, looking for danger. So our clients that have PTSD, complex PTSD, they're very much engaged in their interoception on a 24/7 basis around what is dangerous and picking up on that and experiencing triggers that then activate the polyvagal system, which we'll be talking about. Frank gets into that. When we ask our clients to focus internally, we're having them focus on the actual neural networks affected by their trauma. And we engage them in talk therapy. We're primarily pulling from the prefrontal cortex, but when we're doing this internal family systems work, we're pulling from everywhere. We're pulling from everything, the whole brain and the mind. So I always say that when I'm doing talk therapy, basically I'm the therapist and I am directing the therapy. But when we're doing some type of internal work, then we're accessing the brain, and the brain is there to do the natural healing process of the brain, which is AIP, for those of you that are familiar with the adaptive information processing model. So I'm not going to go over this to honor time, because I did not expect this to go as long as it has. But on my website, there's an interview. It's a great way to identify parts. It's open-ended questions that you can ask. It's basically asking a part to the client to find the part and to see what colors associated with it, where it's located in your body. Does it move around, have a shape or form? Do you see it, hear it? This comes from Frank. And then this is the interview that I have on my website. And a lot of my therapists use this. I use it all the time. I've pretty much got it memorized. I think the interesting thing is not only does it have the interview of the part, but then, this came from Walker, it's also asking the information that you need around how the part helps you. And then not only that, but here are unblending questions that you can ask where the self would be able to answer them. And if the self can't answer them, if the client's higher capital S self can't answer them, you can be answering them for the client, mentoring and holding that self for your client. And that's direct access. And we'll talk about that more. And then integration questions, like how do we integrate the work? One of the things that Dr. Schwartz tells us is we need 14 to 21 days of follow through after your session in order to get this to be transformational. And we're not used to that as EMDR therapists because it's transformational right there. But these are great questions around how you can start integrating the work that you did. And so now we have Laura that's going to move into chapter 7 on feeling toward gaining access to self energy. I will stop share, Laura.
All right. That was incredible, Paula. You've got such a nice summary and then bringing in so much other material too. It's really fun to see.
Thank you.
So let me see here. All right, I'm just getting my windows organized.
And Laura.
Sorry, Paula, I just clicked mute on you right there.
That's the end of that. Can you all see this slide?
One way to shut me up, Eric.
All right, slides up. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So
That's great.
I'll try to do this chapter justice, but there is a lot of good stuff in there. But we will talk a little bit about like self-energy in general, and then how we might work with it a little bit differently with clients who have a history of complex trauma. We will go over the feel towards step and what we're trying to do there and why. And we'll talk a little bit about unblending, whether that's unblending our own parts or helping clients to unblend from theirs. And then we'll touch in on the concept of like compassion versus empathy and how we really work with both of those together. So, oh, okay, there we go. It's advancing. So self-energy is a little bit of a vague concept sometimes, and it can be hard to explain, especially to clients, of what we're talking about. But it's this idea that all of us have inside of us and then access to this network of energy that doesn't have an agenda outside of healing and well-being. So it's not invested in things happening a certain way. And it's able to really hold the curiosity and this nice, gentle, positive intention. It's a way that we can zoom out and see the whole perspective of what's happening rather than being dialed in and seeing things through the eyes of a part. So this is probably like the most important real mechanism in IFS is this idea of we need self energy, and our goal is to help the client to access that self energy and then build a relationship with parts so the whole system can function more smoothly together. So Anderson describes this as this tingling in his body, this titanium core, this connection to the spiritual realm. And each of you will have a way that you notice when you're in self energy too. Oftentimes it comes up in connection with nature, um, connection to something bigger than ourselves, like when we're with our people, and then we're able to notice this, and it kind of overlaps with the flow state some of the time. But you really know when you're connected to it, and keeping in mind that this connection's on a continuum, so it's not that any of us are in self energy all the time, but it's something that we can tap into and have more of an experience of it flowing through us. And the more we have of that in general, the more of a sense of well-being we have, and the more our decisions make sense in the big picture. We can always go back to like the C qualities as far as like how we know if there's access to self energy. And this will be really important when we're asking the feel towards question, because when clients are reflecting these C qualities in their answers, that tells us like, okay, there's some self energy there. The client's able to channel that. And that's absolutely essential for moving from the first three steps of the find, focus, flush out, and then into the befriend and finding out fears. Because the protector parts won't trust us if there's not enough self energy. They won't trust the client self to show up if the client self is blended with other parts. So it will circle right back to how we're working with the feel towards step, but we're also going to just look at this in the big picture too. So with complex trauma, we know like working with these clients can be super challenging, and we know that they have been surviving and have not necessarily had the opportunity to live with a lot of self energy when they're young, and that might not have been modeled for them even. So it's not that they don't have the self energy, we all have it. It's that there's like a wall in between that's created by this trauma when the protector parts are really just trying to like buckle down and protect the wounded parts from getting hurt worse. They'll do whatever seems to work in the short term. So whatever strategies were necessary to have some sense of safety, whether that's pushing away, um, withdrawing, bursting with anger. Really, there's a number of strategies, and it's just whatever seemed to work to get them through that moment. And then over time, these become really entrenched. So often that's what we're working with. And it takes time. Like it takes so much time and so much like openness and being trustworthy in order for these parts to soften a little bit. And then there's more of that space for self energy. So in the book, Anderson talks about this as the container theory, or this idea that protective parts have had to take on such extreme roles and be so active, it kind of pushes down the self energy, and there isn't room for that self energy to come in and respond as things are happening because there's never been that sense of safety. And then oftentimes those protective parts will perpetuate the dynamic in the system. because life will continue to be chaotic if we're working from protectors and going from one crisis to the next. So what we're really looking to do is validate these protector parts and get to know the system. And we do that one at a time and with this sense of curiosity and sometimes a little bit of playfulness, and really like using hugs to help that part to know that it's safe and it can be a little bit different with us, and really modeling what it's like to be a safe person and to create the space for that safe therapeutic relationship. So another way that it can be helpful to think about parts in complex trauma is with this analogy of like protective parts being more of like the military that comes in when leadership is threatened and there's a wartime things happening, like with our complex trauma clients in early life. So what happens is these protective parts will start to jump in out of necessity and really with this urgency to protect from more pain. And they'll do the best job that they know how with their limited perspective and their limited modeling and experiences. And they'll work together to keep the pain from coming up as much as they can and to keep that person safe. But we also want to keep in mind that these parts are not much older than the parts they're protecting. So if somebody's like 5 or 6 years old and they need protective parts, those protective parts can be barely older. And really, from this perspective of we're just going to do what works and we're doing the best we can, considering the lack of support. So think of then when we're going in as a therapist and working with these parts, are they going to trust us right away, or like what will they think of this like nice therapist who doesn't necessarily understand the history but is asking for them to do something different? So this is where we want to slow down and like really get to know these parts individually and find out how long they've been doing what they've been doing, what their intention is, if they feel like it's working. And as we lean into that, parts will soften. And usually we'll find out that like they don't really like their job either. And they do want some help, but this is all pretty foreign to them. So I threw that in just because it's been helpful to me. Um, and hopefully that's something that will be helpful to you as well. We're going to like circle back here as promised and look at how this self-energy concept comes up in the feel towards question. So when we're asking this question, we're kind of in this spot between getting to know the part from the client's perspective of like how they notice this part, what they might think that it does, like what color, shape, texture it is, and really seeing it from that perspective. And then we're going to go into more of getting to know the part's perspective more directly. But in order to do that, we first need to make sure there's enough self-energy in the system that the protector part we're targeting will feel safe enough being in connection with the client, which means we need more energy, more self-energy from the client rather than energy from other parts that might be blended with the client. So when we ask this question, we're looking for some reflection that tells us that there's some of the C qualities are coming through. And sometimes we get that, and sometimes we really don't. So we've got some examples here of if a client is asked this question and then they say, like, I feel compassionate towards it. I get why it's here. Like, I want to help it. I want to help it to do something different. Like we kind of get that there's some self energy there. But oftentimes what actually happens is the client will say, well, I don't like it. Like I'm so sick of this part. It's been doing this forever. It really gets in the way. And when we have an answer like that, then that lets us know there's another part that's blended with the client, and we want to help that other part to unblend or step back and give us a little bit of space. So if that's the case, then we're going back into unblending, which is just this idea of helping the client to know that it's a part that's coming up and then to get some space from that part so they can see the broader perspective again. And remembering that parts are really useful as far as getting information and we want to understand them, but they only see a really limited perspective. And once we unblend, then the client is able to really see things from this broader perspective and have more information on what needs to happen in the system. So these are a few questions that we might ask, but we're really just asking the client to see if the part that doesn't like the other part would mind stepping back or giving some space. Or does that part need something first? Or does it have something it wants to say first? And seeing if it will go back and just step aside and maybe watch or sit on the person's shoulder and watch. Like it's whatever language seems to fit is fine. But with this idea that that part can be there, if it needs to speak, it can speak. But we want a little bit of space to re-engage the original target part in a way that feels safe to that target part. So hopefully this is all making sense as far as what we're helping the client to do. And then we'll also like look briefly at what happens on the therapist side, which this is also in the chapter and fits in really nicely. But it's also so important that we're able to create this space of safety. So in IFS language, like we can think of it as functioning from our own self energy or having that critical mass of self energy available during the session, and really being able to stay with that curiosity and compassion. And as we're doing that, we're creating space for those protectors to feel seen and heard and to relax a little bit into that space that we're creating so we can begin to build relationships with them. And I don't know about you all, but I have days where that's harder than others to keep that self energy access open. And I have clients that can sometimes push buttons, or in IFS language, like they're kind of poking at my parts, and my parts will want to come in and say something, explain something, or justify it. And we really want to get good at noticing when that's happening. So just in the interest of time, we won't do discussion with these, but just thinking for yourself, like what comes up for you when you're in that place where you're really working to stay in self energy, and then there's some part that's been activated or something's happening that could kind of pull you off track. And some questions we can ask are like, how are we feeling towards this person's protector part? Do I have an agenda of like what it needs to do? Or am I feeling that impatience? Like, okay, let's go ahead and just get to the exile already. How many more times are we going to do this? And when we notice that, we want to take a moment with our own part and see if that part can give us a little bit of space too. And we may or may not name that with the client, but the important thing is that we're noticing it and then we're asking our own part to give us some space so that we can show up with more of our own self energy. So, and this leads into this compassion versus empathy. And wouldn't say it's a dilemma, but it's finding the right balance of how we use these together. And in a nutshell, like when we're coming from a place of lots of empathy, that means we're blended with one of our own parts. So we're able to really like relate to the client's part, but we're doing that from this limited perspective. And that can be really helpful up to a point. Like it's essential to have that in order to attune to our client and to get a sense of like what they're experiencing. And then we also want to kind of shift back or zoom out to this lens of compassion. And part of the reason that we want to do that is in a place of compassion, we've got more access to self energy and we're able to see that wider perspective. And we'll also be more regulated and be able to stay with that broad agenda of we want well being and healing in whatever way that happens. Whereas empathy is a part, so that empathetic part will have more of an agenda of this is what I needed, or this is what I still need, so this is what's going to work for you. And we really want to take that as information, but then broaden back out and create that space and work with the client system to get a sense of what their solution might be. Um, it really holding our own like self-regulation throughout that session rather than getting invested in that outcome or like becoming maybe like too emotional to the point where the client doesn't have that sense of safety or they feel like they have to take care of our parts. So really it's this shifting back and forth, but keeping more with this compassion idea and then noticing and using empathy for information as we go. So I think that covers most of the key points in this chapter. And really my takeaways from it are this takes a lot of time and patience, which we already knew, but it's also in slowing down and really taking the time, like that's where we see a lot of change too. So it's not necessarily getting to the exile and unburdening, but it's giving the client system a new way to be and a new way to notice like what's happening in their own experiences. And then to make space for this idea of self energy and really building this hope that things could be different as we move forward together. So I was in a level 2 training over the weekend. And something that stood out to me that I really want to share with you all is this idea that if we want somebody to take their coat off, we could think of it as we can be the wind or the sun and we can blow and blow and blow and like, try to get that coat off of them. Or we can just bring a lot of warmth and a lot of kindness and make it a nice environment, and then that coat comes off eventually, and it will feel much smoother when it does come off. So this idea of we want to bring that warmth and kindness to the protective system, and then we'll get to where we want to go, just in a smoother way. So I'm going to unshare here.
Oh my
And
gosh, I love the colors. You and I are using the same.
the same
I love
strategy.
it. Yeah. It's so fun, right? You spend all night making PowerPoints now.
So
You know, there are two things that that Laura referred to. Are the slides up, Laura?
um and I'm not a good person to ask. Let me
Yeah.
see.
Oh,
Yes,
Eric.
yeah, you're up.
Okay, because we're gonna fly through this last chapter, but two things that Laura spoke to, and that was a great presentation on chapter 7. One is that talking about our own parts. You know, Frank referenced that he spent the majority of his work in therapy around his own parts and how they got activated when working with clients, which I thought was interesting because it would never, not that it wouldn't occur to me, but I remember it was either in like 2017 or 2018, our conference, I think it was out in Seattle, if I had to guess. And Joanne Twombly had like 500 of us in a room, and she had us all place in a chair the client that aggravated us the most. And basically, we did the parts work. We unblended the part, and then we did some work with it. And it was an EMDR conference, so we did some self tapping. And literally, like, she had 500 people doing this all at once. And so, to be able to speak to like what parts that we are engaged in during therapy is really important. I also think this is really important between the empathy versus compassion. Never heard a definition like this, but once integrating it to polyvagal, if you have a client that's in sympathetic nervous system, you want to meet it with compassion, which means you're coming from your higher self, your capital S self energy. But if your client is in a dorsal vagal dissociative shutdown, you want to meet it with empathy, because your feelings are also, because you have a part and your self energy, and it's your feelings, it's your own reactions that help pulls that client out of the dissociation. I've never heard it described like that. So I just, there's just not enough time in the day to really be able to do this book justice. But I just wanted to put those two pieces in there because that was such a powerful chapter. Okay, so I hate to do this, but we're doing chapter 8 really quick. Luckily, it's not, it's basically just a couple pages. But chapter 8 is about befriending. So the hardest part was unblending. The hardest part is finding the capital S energy and taking that part and being able to have self to part energy. So here we are, we're going to befriend. And befriending is once it's been distanced, we want the self to become available and to connect to that part. It's time to start nurturing the internal relationship between the two. We want the self to part connection. And we want to remember that that at one point there was a rift, that there was a conflict created between the two. And so once again, I love that acronym. I should have made a slide for it, but it's WAAAT. Why? I always say what? It's welcoming the part. It's appreciating the part. It's acknowledging the part. It's accepting the part. And that's how you're going to build the trust with the part. And so, we want to think about, how do you feel toward that part with the self to part connection? Remember that language, feel toward, because that's where the space is. Is the part willing or able to take that in? How is the part to self connection? What's coming up for the part? The part may say, I don't care what you say. You weren't there for me then, and you're not there for me now. So that's going to be more for us to look at in our chapters as we move into this book. Often parts are unwilling and not ready to accept positive self energy. They may not trust the self yet. So remember, we want to welcome, we want to accept, appreciate, acknowledge, welcome, accept, appreciate, acknowledge, welcome, accept, appreciate, acknowledge all parts in order to build that trust. Understanding the positive intention of the protector part. So if you can welcome the part, I welcome the part that drinks, I'm opening the door to repair. In other words, the drinking is there, it's there to assist me. Sober stands for son of a bitch, emotions are real. The protector part numbs the emotions. And of course, it would be in dorsal vagal energy because opiates are released into your bloodstream, but we need to befriend it. We need to be able to share with it. Like, I get it. Like, here we are with our validation. I get you. I understand. I see you. It's that you're there to help me. And then once you're able to, the client self is able to align with that positive intention of the protector part, it's essential to learn about its fear, because there's your opportunity. Unzip that protector part. What wounded child part is in there? Ask the client's part this critical question. What are you afraid will happen if you don't do its job? This question will either reveal the exile that the protector part is protecting, or it will reveal a different part within the client system. Remember, the more that you heal, the more that you reveal. And then we're not going to have time to go over these, but at the end of the day, this is about asking the protector what it is that they fear. And the topics are being overwhelmed, what would happen if the protector was freed up to do other things, if the protector part is capable of moving forward, is there judgment by the therapist, can the protector part permit us to heal the wound. There's responses for all of these that Frank has come up with. And one of this, we are in this together, we're going to heal this pain together. The client may be worried that they're going to lose the therapist, and what would that look like? Maybe feeling good is scary, and so we need to trust those feelings. And then would the client protector part be interested in what we're going to be working with the pain, and at the end of the day, asking all parts to step back so that we can work with the pain of the exile. So, okay, you guys, that's 2 minutes to spare. You know what? Did you guys even see these slides while I was speaking about them?
No, I think we were stuck on that first one.
Oh, that's too bad. Anyway, it's here because for the recording, you can read it. It's everything that I just talked about, and there's not a lot here. And I did put up what Frank has on page 50. This is the protector fear. And then these are the common responses once again. And so we've got a lot of options here, what the protector part may be upset about, and then what it is that we can respond with. We have a whole book here of working with and getting to those exiles. So now that you've got a general idea of what those 6 F's look like, now we can really start getting into the details around the neurobiology, around PTSD, and breaking down where the complex trauma comes in. And here is my, oh, I'm so sorry those slides weren't there. Here's my final slide. How did you find the book study? If you could put that in the chat, and if you have a takeaway, and then have a great week. And we'll see you all on November 18th for our next round, 9:30 to 11 Central Time. So Laura, I know that you need to leave. So if you do, you go ahead, and I'm going to stick around. And if anybody wants to ask questions, or if you could put some responses in the chat just to let us know how we're doing, and we'll see you all in a month.
Thank you all so much, and have a great week. Bye.
Hi, Laura.